Hello angels and anti-heroes, my name is TV Skyen, and well, the rework is out and they have both been fully updated, so it's time to re-ask the question. What's the deal with Kayle and Morgana? As always, we'll start with their updated lore to get a grasp on the kind of story that the character designs are trying to express, and then we'll take a look at their visuals to see how well they match up and express the themes that are being put forward. So, I'm going to summarize the story in brief, but if you want a full run-through of Kayle and Morgana's new narrative, you can head on over to my colleague Nick Crit's channel and his excellent lore summary, link in the description. Kayle and Morgana are the twin daughters of the Targonian aspect of justice, aspect being people like Leona, Diana, Tarek, Zoe, and Pantheon, who are empowered to represent a certain set of traits and values by the celestial powers that dwell atop Mount Targon. Anyway, Kayle and Morgana's mother ascends to an aspect while she's still pregnant, and after giving birth to the two girls, their mother goes off pretty much fighting wars for the rest of her life. Their father, Kayle, fears for the girls' safety and moves them to Demacia, where the magic-absorbing powers of the petricite forest that surrounds the place can protect them from the devastating magic wars on the continent. This happens around the founding of Demacia, so this is centuries in the past of the present day of the League of Legends universe. Kayle and Morgana are as different, according to the story, as day and night. Kayle grows obsessed with martial prowess, with rules and laws, and upholding the legacy of her mother as the aspect of justice, while Morgana develops sympathy for the outsiders and oppressed and grows concerned about Demacia's mounting xenophobia and fear of mages. The sisters eventually inherit their mother's power, and with that power, Kayle grows ever more committed to the cause of laws and rules, believing she is following in the footsteps of her mother, while Morgana grows ever more alienated from her sister, concerned about outcasts, the negative effects of zealously holding on to the laws, and the consequences of the great powers that they've been given. Kayle and Morgana become famous, inspirational figures to the new nation of Demacia, even as the rift between them grows wider and wider. It all comes to a head when one of Kayle's disciples decides to try and arrest Morgana for sheltering and reforming criminals. Morgana kills him to protect her followers, triggering a riot. Kayle is so enraged by all of this that she and Morgana end up fighting in earnest, which leads unintentionally to the death of their father in the chaos. Kayle blames her human emotions for bringing things so far, and flies away to Targon to cleanse herself of emotional bias and become the perfect embodiment of dispassionate justice. Morgana, on the other hand, takes the whole thing as a tragedy of blind celestial zealotry and binds her wings in chains as a symbolic gesture that she will walk the earth as mortals do, rejecting the obsession with divinity that consumed her sister and killed her father. Morgana stays in Demacia, hiding in the shadows and helping who she can, waiting for Kayle to one day return and for the fight to start again. Right, so let's tease out some themes here. The first and most obvious theme is a conflict between light and dark, but interestingly, rather than working from the light and dark strict oppositional duality that we usually use in the West, i.e. light is good, dark is bad, and never the twain shall meet, Kayle and Morgana are working from more of a yin and yang complementary duality. Now, yin and yang are central concepts to Taoist philosophy, but I don't think Kayle and Morgana are especially a deep application of those philosophies, so we'll keep this to a very surface reading. Basically, where in Western pop culture we will typically see light and dark as destructive opposites that cancel each other out or seek to destroy one another, yin and yang are conceptualized as complementary opposites, two halves of a whole who have opposite qualities but who exist as interdependent and interconnected. As I read the story, Kayle and Morgana together are the aspect of justice. Kayle is that part of justice which is inflexible, dispassionate, exclusionary, and based on law and rules, and Morgana is that part of justice which is compassionate, flexible, inclusive, and based on kindness and emotion. What's especially interesting about this is the imagery that they're associated with. Taoism is considered an Eastern philosophy, typically often associated with China, but Kayle and Morgana are steeped in the visuals of a very different philosophy. Christianity. They appropriate the imagery of seraphs and fallen dark angels, and in Christian theology, light and dark very much cannot coexist. Heaven and hell are in direct opposition and must destroy each other, which ultimately is the situation that Kayle and Morgana end up in. So we have an interesting mix here. Kayle and Morgana are not a simple good versus evil, light versus dark opposite pair. Kayle isn't good just because she represents the light, and Morgana isn't evil just because she represents the dark. If anything, we're playing with a subversion where, aha, the dark one turned out to be more good than the light one. Ooh, she's the scary one you should be frightened of. So does it all work? Well, yeah, for the most part, sure. As a story, it's fully functional. It provides us with some clear stakes, a clear source of conflict, but for me though, it's a little bit boring that this is all bound up in dead parent tropes. Kayle is constantly trying to live up to the example of her dead mother, and Morgana is traumatized by the death of their father, and I'm just kind of bored with characters whose motivation comes from some sort of parental trauma rather than an internal striving. For example, I think it would have been really cool if, when Kayle and Morgana's parents ascended Targon, rather than their mother ascending to Aspect of Justice and then Kayle and Morgana inheriting it, that Kayle and Morgana had been made the Aspect of Justice directly by Targon. Because then, instead of Kayle's story being about how she's constantly chasing her mother's legacy of trying to live up to her, Kayle's story could be about how she comes to hold her own inflexible, obsessed vision of justice through her own experiences and her own rationalizations, not through some twisted ideal of a mother she never knew. Morgana's story, by the same token, could be about how she comes to sympathize with the outcasts and the downtrodden and comes to resent inflexible rulemaking without also being about how she feels bad that her fight with Kayle killed their dad. Right now, the conflict between Kayle and Morgana is in large part a conflict between Kayle's pursuit of their celestial aspect mother and Morgana's sorrow and love for their human father, and I think their relationship would be stronger if that complication was removed, and it was 100% about Kayle and Morgana's relationship as sisters instead of their relationship as children of parents. Like, it annoys me that to some extent you can explain away all of Kayle and Morgana's conflict and all of their ideals and everything they stand for as, oh, it's just some extreme mommy and daddy issues. That may just be me, though. I mean, the stories are functional. It's not that they don't work, it's just that I have some nitpicks. To summarize, Kayle and Morgana are complementary opposites, not destructive opposites, that have been brought into destructive conflict. One of them tries to embody justice through dispassionate, emotionless, rigid structure of rules, while the other embodies justice through emotional, compassionate, and flexible kindness. They're twins, but are described as being otherwise complete opposites in every way. So, the next thing to take a look at is how well those themes and ideas come through in their character design. This video is brought to you by League of Leagues, the online MOBA online game you can play online with your friends online. Go to leagueleague.league.com for 10% off your first ward. Before we get into character design, senior Riot champion designer August Browning tweeted a couple of days ago that Kayle's new armor was supposed to be lighter and sleeker than her old design, but was not supposed to come across as a bodysuit. Because of that, they're going to be making some changes to the character model, specifically in the textures, and some changes to the splash to kind of correct for this. Those changes will be out, I hope, later than this video comes out, and once we have a good look at the changes that they've made, maybe we'll do a little follow-up video to talk about those. But for the moment, we're going to be criticizing this version of Kayle, because that's what we have to work with. Anyway, I'm gonna have a lot of criticisms of Kayle and Morgana, and so to avoid the video just being one long negative rant, we're gonna start off with a segment I call... This video is brought to you by Ebony Legends, the tactical online strategy RPG tactical online MMO game you can play with your friends online. Go to ebonyonlinevideogamelegends.com to receive a free trial for just $5. Morgana used to be one of the clunkiest and ugliest character models in the game, and her character design was an incoherent mess of ideas that didn't work together even a little bit. While I'm going to have some criticisms of Morgana's new character design, I think it's important to recognize just how enormous the base upgrading quality is. The new Morgana model can move, it can emote, and its animations are uniformly gorgeous. Similarly, even though I have a bunch of criticisms of the new Kayle model, on every technical level, it is a massive upgrade in quality and expressiveness. On Kayle, the change towards white, gold, and purple is a positive aesthetic change. For one thing, it connects her better with Demacia, whose primary colors are white and gold, and the bright white also ties her closer to the metaphorical idea of purity, which is what she chases as an ambition. The purple spandex she wears underneath her armor gives her a little bit of color affinity with Morgana. It kind of hints that underneath it all, she's still her sister's twin, that there is a connection between them. We'll touch back on the spandex later as a criticism, but I wanted to at least mention that one of the ideas behind it is narratively solid. I also like that Riot have really committed to the Archangel Seraph design by giving her multiple wings and using them as a character design barometer for her power level. That's a clever way to pull off the theme while also working with Kayle's personal ambition of ascending into a less human, more divine form. This video is brought to you by Smite Heroes Evolved, the MOBA online strategy RPG, tactical RPG, MOBA MMO online, biggest online game. Use the offer code RPG Online MOBA RPG to receive a free offer code. Moving on to Morgana, where the aesthetic of her old model looked like a haunted Christmas elf that melted, her new model is far more cohesive. Like, it looks like she's wearing an actual outfit now. It's a dress rather than a 50-pound leather skirt and a strapless bra for no reason. The old concept for Morgana's wings was that as a fallen angel, they were supposed to be frayed and ruined to contrast Kayle's pristine ones. In the new concept, she has bound her wings in chains on purpose as a symbol of her conscious and willful rejection of her celestial heritage, and I think that's a lot stronger as a narrative element. Simply having ruined wings is a passive character detail, but binding her wings herself is an active choice, and it says a lot more about the mind and motivations of the character. So, the point of this segment is to say that I understand some of the things that Riot were trying to do with Kayle and Morgana's update, and I see some of the good ideas on display. The point of my criticisms is never that Riot's artists and designers are stupid or incompetent, or that you're not allowed to like them because there's this or that wrong with them. The point is critical examination for the purposes of discussion. Having said that,
this video is brought to you by Heroes Angels Smacker Mobile game to play online.
Okay, so in case I've been too subtle with these fake sponsorship cutaways, the point I'm trying to get at here is that Kayle and Morgana look painfully generic. Their character designs look like the empty, pandering, hot fantasy girl designs that some mobile MOBA knockoff title would slap on their internet banner ads. So why is that? Well, it's a lot of things, but TLDR, their designs are sleek, cool, and appealing, but not imaginative, challenging, or interesting. They don't really bring anything new to the field of fantasy game character design. They're just spinning their wheels in the same pothole that everyone else is. So, let's take a somewhat closer look and start with Kayle is supposed to be functionally the patron saint of Demacia, the icon from which Demacia draws its iconography. But where Demacian armor design is otherwise typically bulky, austere, and imposing, Kayle is wearing a skin-tight spandex, ostentatious hide boots, decorative gold shoulder pieces, a tiny little chest plate, and some arm guards. Kayle does aspire to be more Targonian than Demacian, but she doesn't really look like that either. The Targonian aesthetic is obsessed with sun and moon imagery and tends to incorporate lots of fabrics, scarves, sashes, robes, none of which Kayle has. She has some of the color aesthetic of Demacia, but none of its shape. She has some of the decorative elements of Targon, but none of its iconography or materials. If she was meant to be a fusion of the two, she ended up in the exact spot where she expresses the least interesting version of both styles. And then there's her armor design. Now, in the past, I've made the mistake when discussing armor design of getting bogged down in questions of realism. And while that's a discussion that's worth having, the question of whether or not a piece of fantasy armor is realistic or not isn't actually very interesting in the context of the discussions we typically have on this channel, because in a fantasy game like League of Legends, armor isn't really about being functional, it's about being a costume. The armor is an expression of the character who wears it. This is why Poppy is outfitted in tough, sensible leathers and plate, while Mordekaiser looks like someone rolled a He-Man toy in superglue and then threw it into a scrapyard. Poppy's armor is an expression of her practical, traveling nature. Mordekaiser's armor is an expression of him being a ridiculous Saturday morning cartoon villain. That being said, though, if this part of Kayle's chest plate is supposed to be made of hard metal, then how does she bend over? She can't bend over. This large metal spike will pierce directly into her guts, and if these little spiky bits along her sides are supposed to be hard metal, how does she twist her torso without stabbing herself? Again, I don't necessarily think the armor needs to be realistic, but it should at least be plausible. It should be plausible that a person could wear it without fatally stabbing themselves immediately upon making a normal body movement. Like I mentioned earlier, Riot are apparently working on some changes to that part of the design, but I have to say this feels like the kind of baffling design decision that can only really happen when an artist submits a character design without being subjected to serious adversarial critique from their peers. Like, it feels like the artist just put the spike there because it looks cool and didn't really think through the implications, and then nobody else bothered thinking through the implications either, or didn't bother to say anything. Anyway, armor is a costume, so it's supposed to express the character wearing it. So what does Kayle's armor say about her? We've talked about how the white and gold ties her to Demacia somewhat, but what about Kayle's own character? According to the lore, she's an uncompromising, inflexible, merciless, obsessive judicator of laws and rules. She's obsessed with ascending fully to becoming the aspect of justice, and believes that her powers and abilities exist for the express purpose of enforcing order. Additionally, due to the death of her father in an emotional confrontation with her sister, she believes she needs to purge all human emotion from her soul in order to accomplish these goals. Emotionless, unsentimental, rigid, and rules-obsessed. But is that what she looks like, though? Not really. Kayle's armor is full of decorative details, like the gold wings on her boots, the weird mohawk on her helmet, and those pointless shoulder pieces. It's even got decorative gold furnishings, like this pendant-looking thing and these arrows lovingly coiling over her breasts. Details like that are vanity, not in the sense of being evil or sinful, but in the sense of being needless decoration for the purpose of satisfying the wearer's emotional needs, which again, there's nothing wrong with, but it's the opposite of the kind of person Kayle wants to be. She wants to be an impartial, impersonal, faceless, perfect embodiment of justice, absent the kinds of biases that humans have, like taste or aesthetic. One way to express that a character is inflexible and hard-edged is to make them physically inflexible and hard-edged as well. Armor is a great way to do this, and as a bonus, plate armor is commonly associated with knights, soldiers, and crusaders, people who pledge themselves to serve some kind of higher ideal than themselves. Similarly, a shell of hard armor conceals and erases the personality that inhabits it. It makes you faceless and even dehumanizes a character. A suit of armor can contain anyone and anything, even the fire of an ideal. But Kayle doesn't wear plate armor. She wears a small, curvy breastplate shaped around her body and a spandex. Now, spandex is associated with gymnasts, dancers, figure skaters, and circus acts, and the reason why those people wear spandex is because spandex is flexible. It's elastic, it's easy to move around in, it deforms and stretches to suit any situation. Kayle is wearing a garment which is literally the opposite of everything she stands for, and not in a subtle way either. Her character design is showy, gaudy, vain, personal, impractical, and flexible, when her character is supposed to be the opposite of all of those things. But the thing that takes the cake for me in calling this a bad character design is her helmet. Not the fact that she's wearing one. In fact, that's one of the things that her base design gets right, but it's what happens to the helmet. Now, like we touched on, armor can make you faceless. It can dehumanize you, make you the embodiment of an order or a set of values and ideals, and obscuring the face with a helmet is one of the best ways to achieve this. Human brains are programmed to look for faces and to try and empathize with them, so take that human face away and you are alienated on a very basic level. But as Kayle goes through the game, as she levels up, she changes form multiple times. As she is ascending towards her ultimate power, the ultimate expression of her ideal as the aspect of justice, she grows more wings, becoming ever more divine and seraph-like. Now, this is an amazing idea for the character, and it would have worked so well, except in her final ascension, her ultimate form, the moment when she's supposed to become the most like her ideal of impersonal, inhuman, unemotional, platonic justice, the helmet comes off. The helmet comes off. It reveals her face, her eyes, her vulnerability, her emotionality, her humanity. Instead of being the ultimate expression of her own ideals, she becomes a complete negation of them. Now, you can argue that odds because they're making a clever subversive point about how Kayle is actually human and emotional after all in her quest for perfection is hypocrisy and she has mommy issues and she needs to reconcile with her sister or whatever. And okay, alright. But that's like having Jarvan reach max level and all of a sudden he tears all his armor off because he's realized that feudal monarchy is an oppressive form of government and he must institute a democracy. I think that having Kayle tear off her helmet and abandon her pretenses of dispassion and act in anger would be a great story beat, something to show the raging conflict within the character in a lore story, or in a comic, or an animated short, but it just doesn't work as a part of her base character design. This is supposed to be a moment of transformation, of progression. It doesn't work as her status quo. The transformation mechanic that Kayle has is cool as hell, and it's an amazing idea, but they're doing it the wrong way around. As Kayle grows more powerful, grows closer to her ideal, she should be adding armor, not removing it. She should be making herself more inhuman, more hard-edged and inflexible. She should be clamming herself up more and more in the shell of her own power. Taking the helmet off is upside-down moon logic. Frankly, I think Kayle's old character design had it right. Faceless, armor-covered, devoid of identity, and devoid of emotionality. Old Kayle is an impersonal, avenging angel enforcing order from the sky. New Kayle entirely misses the point of that and then manages to make it worse. So, the core concepts of Kayle and Morgana is that they are opposites, where Kayle is dispassionate, Morgana is compassionate. Where Kayle is inflexible, Morgana is flexible. Where Kayle is trying to purge her humanity, Morgana is trying to purge her divinity. Like I said earlier, the idea of having Morgana shackle her own wings is brilliant, and it works very well for her character design, especially as a contrast to Kayle, who just can't have enough wings and keep adding more as the game goes on. The trouble, though, is that outside of that and the color contrast between their color schemes, Morgana isn't actually much of an opposite to her sister. See, thematically, Kayle is all about embodying martial power, unbending rules, unbreakable law, enforcement of order, hierarchies. Now, the idea with Morgana's new character design seems to be that where Kayle is all about military sparseness, Morgana is about comfort and couture. Of the two sisters, Morgana is the one who wears the sexy dress with the fur lining, comfortable and soft, where her sister is hard and unyielding, and that, it sort of works. I mean, it's a good idea in theory, but the problem is, Morgana dresses like a member of the aristocracy. She's wearing a long, sexy evening gown with cleavage and a bare back. She's wearing high fashion and adorns herself with jewelry. And the trouble with that is, aristocratic high-fashion diva isn't the opposite of Kayle's rigid hierarchical militarism. The opposite of Kayle's rigid militarism is egalitarianism, it's anarchism, it's working-class resistance to oppression, it's collectivism, it's the abolishment of law and hierarchies, it's libertarian, it's communist, it's whatever version you prefer, but what it is not is the idle hereditary aristocracy of oppressive feudalism. But that is what Morgana has dressed herself like. Kayle stands for the rule of law and order, for social hierarchy. Morgana, in her visual design, stands for the people who write the laws and sit on top of the social hierarchy. Those are not opposites. And what's worse is that according to the story, Morgana is the opposite of Kayle. She's the one who rejects divinity, rejects laws, rejects rules and order, who walks among mortals using her powers with compassion to help heal and reform. She's the one who rejects Kayle's delusions of superiority. She wants, in very literal terms, to be one of the people, one of the mortals that Kayle holds herself so far above, but none of that really comes across in her character design. So, what could they do instead? Well, instead of being inspired by evening wear for rich people, there's another aesthetic which contains within it a strong association with anti-authoritarianism, rebellion, and resistance to hierarchies, and it could even work with Morgana's purple color scheme, her new hairstyle, and her penchant for runny makeup. Punk aesthetic. Now, in League of Legends, punk is already mostly associated with Saw and especially champions like Jinx, but it should be possible to create, as it were, a Demacian version of punk. Punk aesthetics are typically informed by working-class fashions and intentional perversions of the aesthetics and visuals of whoever is in the ruling class. To that end, where Demacia is austere, purity-obsessed, sheer, clean, and rigid, Morgana could be flamboyant, dirty, excessive, and outrageous. Wearing too many belts, wearing torn or dirty clothes, ironically appropriating pieces from military uniforms. Her aesthetic could be mismatched and asymmetrical, all over the place, basically. And that would express Morgana's belief in dissidence and divergence as the opposite to Kayle's one-rule-fits-all zealotry. Now, there are other options than just the punk aesthetic for that, of course, but it has to be something that represents an actual egalitarian opposite to Kayle's ideology. It has to be something that flies directly in the face of everything Kayle believes in, something which aligns with the majority of ordinary people, rather than the minority of rule makers and law writers. Now, there's one more way these character designs do kind of a bad job at making the sisters opposites, and that is their physicality. Now, Kayle and Morgana are twins, so it makes sense that they have similar faces, similar general builds, and etc. However, there's a real lost opportunity here to do storytelling with their physical shapes. Kayle, for example, has the generic slender athletic build that Riot have used for a dozen other female champions already, but Kayle is all about force, rigidity, unyielding strength, all of that jazz. To that end, a more muscular build would make sense for her, something that emphasizes her martial training, her rigid discipline, and her desire to rid herself of human flaws and weaknesses. Of course, the simple solution to that is to just put her in a dehumanizing shell of armor, and then none of this will matter, but she's flying around in a vacuum-sealed spandex suit, so we're gonna have to work with what we have. Similarly, Morgana is the opposite of Kayle, and so if Kayle is all about training and discipline and strength and fitness, why not make Morgana an indulgent hedonist? Make her curvy, choppy. Hell, why not make her fat? Like, there's 150 champions. Having one fat lady in the roster won't kill anyone. Just do something that reflects the idea that these people are twins, but who lead opposite lifestyles, and that those opposite lifestyles have had an effect on their bodies. Like, hell, how about this? Kayle has the inhumanly perfect Olympian physique sculpted in the image of a god, while Morgana has the body of a flawed, slightly out of shape ordinary person. Something, like whatever your preference. My point is, just copy-pasting the same exact body to two completely different people is boring, and it's a waste of an opportunity to do storytelling through design. So, to sum up briefly, the Kayle and Morgana reworks are technical upgrades over their previous versions. They have much better and more compelling lores that make far more sense for the League of Legends universe. I have some nitpicks about the stories, but nothing major. Their character designs contain the germs of some decent ideas, but they are executed very poorly. Kayle loses a number of good elements from her old design in favor of some truly baffling costuming decisions, while Morgana's design ended up aesthetically aligning with something that's completely opposite to her concept, seemingly for no other reason than because it made it easier to make her stick close to her old design. Riot are hopefully going to alleviate a bit of what's wrong with Kayle when they update her, but from my perspective, this update as a whole comes out as a side grade at best. The technical upgrades and the model fidelity and animations are only sort of making up for some very short-sighted, uncreative decisions and wasted opportunities in the character design. Hey, as it turns out, the texture changes that were promised came out right as I was almost done recording this video, and looking at them, yeah, I mean, it's a slight improvement. Her breastplate looks more like a breastplate and less like a part of her spandex, but it still has the spike around the guts, and it still has the spikes on the sides, and doesn't really change much about my opinion. As a side note, yes, I have seen all of the suggested changes from various members of the communities, people who have done substantially better work trying to update the Kayle model to be something that more closely resembles the fantasy that she's supposed to deliver. I think all of them are pretty much better than what Riot have come up with, but it's not going to be implemented, so Hey, thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, well, I'm glad, because good lord did it take forever to write and edit. You can hit the like button, the subscribe button, the bell icon button, all kinds of buttons, and it's all nice and helpful and good, and you get to see more videos that way. If you are able and willing, you can support the channel directly via Patreon with whatever. If you have $1 a month and you don't mind me using that dollar to help pay my rent, well, then I'd be very grateful for the help. If you don't want to sign up for a monthly subscription, but you just want to give me like a one-time tip to say, hey, good job spending all that time talking about some video game characters, then follow the link below to Ko-fi, where you can make a one-time donation. If you're not willing or able to do either of those things, that's completely okay. I'm just happy that you watched the video this far. If you haven't enjoyed the video, well, there's a dislike button down below, and every time you click on it, the CEO of YouTube will get on a plane, fly across the Atlantic, and personally show up at my house to tell me, hey, someone in Wisconsin didn't like your video. It was a video that they disliked. I don't know why she insists that everyone who dislikes my videos lives in Wisconsin, but she seems very sure of it, so I guess go Milwaukee Brewers.